The morning I walked out of my front door and found an empty space where my truck should have been, I didn't panic, I didn't call the police, and I definitely didn't wonder whether it had been stolen. I already knew exactly who had taken it. The strange thing is that I'd spent nearly 8 years living in that neighborhood without any major problems. My house sat on the edge of a quiet subdivision called Cedar Ridge, about 30 minutes outside of Nashville. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable. Families walked their dogs in the evenings. Kids rode bikes until sunset, and most people minded their own business. At least that's how it used to be. Things started changing when a guy named Randall Pierce became president of the Homeowners Association. Randall was one of those men who always looked like he was running for office, even when he was just checking his mailbox. Perfect haircut, pressed polo shirts, expensive watch, and a smile that somehow felt more threatening than friendly. The first year he took over, nobody really cared. The grass got trimmed more often, the entrance sign got repainted, and everyone assumed he was doing a decent job. Then little by little, the letters started showing up. A warning about mailbox colors. A notice about holiday decorations staying up too long. Complaints about garbage cans being visible from a street. Every month, there seemed to be some new rule nobody remembered voting for. My trouble started because of my truck. It wasn't some rusted-out junkyard vehicle. It was a clean black Ford F-350 that I used for work and for hauling equipment to a small piece of farmland I owned outside town. I'd parked in my driveway for years. Same spot, same angle, same truck. Nobody had ever complained before. Then one afternoon, I opened my mailbox and found a bright yellow violation notice. According to the HOA, my truck was considered visually disruptive and inconsistent with community appearance standards. I remember laughing out loud when I read it. My wife, Melissa, was standing in the kitchen when I walked inside. I tossed the paper onto the counter and said, "Apparently my truck is offensive now." She skimmed the letter and rolled her eyes. "They're seriously complaining about that? Looks that way. You gonna respond?" I shrugged. Respond to what? It's parked on my property. That was honestly the end of the conversation as far as I was concerned. But it wasn't the end for Randall. Over the next few weeks, more letters arrived. Each one sounded more aggressive than the last. First, they requested compliance. Then they demanded compliance. Then they threatened fines. Every notice carried Randall's signature at the bottom, like he was signing executive orders. At first, I ignored them because I figured common sense would eventually win. Then one evening while I was watering the lawn, my neighbor Frank wandered over holding a beer. Frank had lived across the street longer than I had. He glanced toward my driveway and shook his head. "You getting hit with the truck letters, too?" "Too?" I asked. He laughed. "Randall's been trying to get rid of trucks for over a year. Says they make the neighborhood look blue-collar." I stared at him. "We're in Tennessee." Frank raised his beer. "Exactly." That was the first time I realized this wasn't really about parking. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about property values. It was about image. Randall wanted the neighborhood to look like something out of a real estate brochure, and my truck didn't fit the picture he had in his head. A few days later, I received what they called a final warning. The letter claimed continuing violations could result in fines, enforcement actions, and vehicle removal. Vehicle removal. I remember reading that line 3 times because it sounded so ridiculous. Surely they couldn't tow a truck off private property simply because they didn't like how it looked. I even called the HOA office and asked. The receptionist gave me a carefully rehearsed answer about community guidelines and board authority. When I asked whether they could legally remove a vehicle from my driveway, she suddenly became very interested in transferring me to voicemail. That should have been my warning. 3 mornings later, I stepped outside, carrying a cup of coffee, looked toward the driveway, and froze. The truck was gone. Just gone. The coffee nearly slipped from my hand. For a few seconds, I stood there staring at the empty concrete, like maybe my eyes weren't working. Then anger hit me so fast it felt physical. I marched back inside, grabbed my phone, and started making calls. 45 minutes later, I finally reached the towing company. The dispatcher confirmed they had my truck. "Authorized removal," she said. Request came through from the Homeowners Association. Hearing those words made my blood boil. By lunchtime, I was standing in an industrial lot surrounded by chain-link fencing and wrecked vehicles, paying nearly $800 to get my own truck back. As the tow operator handed over the paperwork, he glanced around and lowered his voice. Off the record, buddy, I thought this whole thing was crazy. HOA pushed hard, said they'd keep issuing penalties if we didn't take it. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. Then I climbed into my truck and drove home in silence. The entire way back, I kept replaying everything in my head. The letters, the threats, Randall's obsession with appearances, the smug language in every notice. By the time I pulled into my driveway, something had changed inside me. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was determination. Because the truth was, they didn't tow my truck because it broke a rule. They towed it because they assumed I would quietly accept it. They assumed I'd pay the fee, move the truck, and fall in line like everyone else. Standing there in my driveway that afternoon, staring at the place where my truck had been taken from only hours earlier, I made a decision. If Randall wanted to start a war over vehicles, I was about to introduce him to a vehicle he would never forget. The funny thing about revenge is that most people imagine it happening in a burst of anger. They picture somebody slamming a door, shouting into a phone, or making some reckless decision they'll regret later. That wasn't what happened with me. After getting my truck back, I didn't do anything for 2 days. I went to work. I fed the animals out at my farm. I fixed a broken fence line. I slept on it. And the more I thought about what Randall and the HOA had done, the calmer I became. Not because I was letting it go, but because I was starting to see exactly where their weakness was. Randall loved rules when the rules worked for him. He loved authority when he got to wield it. What he couldn't stand was losing control of the narrative. He wanted the neighborhood to look perfect. He wanted people to see him as the guy protecting property values and maintaining standards. What he never expected was somebody using those same standards against him. The idea came to me while I was out at my farm early one morning. The sun had barely cleared the hills when I looked across the equipment shed and spotted my old Massey Ferguson tractor sitting there covered in a thin layer of dust. That tractor was impossible to ignore. Bright red paint, massive rear tires, a front loader attachment that looked like it belonged on a construction site. It wasn't ugly. In fact, I love that machine. But it definitely wasn't the kind of vehicle Randall wanted featured in the neighborhood newsletter. I stood there staring at it for a moment and slowly started smiling. By lunchtime, I'd already checked city parking ordinances. By dinner, I had confirmed there were no restrictions preventing agricultural equipment from parking on certain public streets near commercial buildings. By the next morning, I had my answer. If Randall wanted to make a statement with my truck, I was going to make a much bigger statement with my tractor. Melissa knew something was brewing. She watched me studying maps at the kitchen table and finally asked, "What exactly are you planning?" I looked up. "Something legal." She sighed. "That doesn't make me feel better. Trust me." She pointed a finger at me. Whenever somebody says trust me, bad decisions usually follow. I laughed. Not this time. Early the next morning, I fired up the tractor. The engine roared to life with that deep diesel rumble that every farmer recognizes instantly. I loaded it onto a trailer and started the drive toward town. The entire trip, I couldn't stop grinning. Not because I wanted to cause trouble, but because for the first time since my truck got towed, I felt like I was taking back control. About an hour later, I pulled up near the HOA administrative office. Their building sat at the entrance of a small business complex surrounded by neatly trimmed landscaping and decorative brickwork. Everything about it screamed carefully managed appearances. I unloaded the tractor slowly. A few people walking nearby stopped to watch. One guy carrying coffee nearly walked into a sign because he was staring at the machine. Then I climbed aboard, drove it directly to a perfectly legal street parking space right in front of the HOA office, shut off the engine, and climbed down. Just like that, the tractor became their new neighbor. Day one was surprisingly quiet. Nobody called. Nobody emailed. Nobody came outside yelling. I suspect they thought I would move it after a few hours. Maybe they assumed I was visiting somebody nearby. But I wasn't. The tractor stayed exactly where it was. Bright red, 30 feet from their front door. Every person entering or leaving the office had to walk right past it. On the second day, the email arrived. Subject line, unauthorized vehicle concern. I almost laughed before opening it. The message claimed that several community representatives had expressed concern regarding a large piece of equipment parked near administrative property. Concern. That word always cracks me up because it's usually used by people who are actually angry. The email went on to explain how the tractor negatively affected the professional image of the association. Professional image. There was again. Image. Everything always came back to image. I took a picture of my truck sitting peacefully in my driveway and replied with a single sentence. If my vehicle cannot exist on my private property, then your organization probably shouldn't be commenting on vehicles parked legally on public property. I hit send and went about my day. The response came faster than I expected. Around 4 that afternoon, my phone rang. Randall Pierce. For a moment, I just stared at the screen before answering. Hello. There was a pause. Then Randall's voice came through tight and controlled. Mr. Carter, I assume you're responsible for the tractor parked outside our office. That's my tractor. It's creating a problem. Interesting. Another pause. What exactly is interesting? Well, my truck apparently created a problem too. I could almost hear him grinding his teeth. Those situations are entirely different. Ow! Your vehicle violated community standards. According to who? According to the board. The same board you run? Silence. Then he changed tactics. Residents have been complaining. I leaned back in my chair. Funny thing about that. I'm a resident, and I've been complaining too. The call ended a few minutes later without either of us getting anywhere. But something important happened during that conversation. For the first time, Randall sounded frustrated. Not powerful, not confident, frustrated. By the 4th day, the whole situation had taken on a life of its own. It started with social media. Somebody posted a picture of the tractor online with the caption, "Newest HOA board member." Then another photo appeared. Then another. Before long, people from neighboring communities were driving by just to see it. One afternoon, I stopped by to check on things and found 3 teenagers taking selfies next to it. A delivery driver was standing nearby laughing. Is this actually somebody's protest? He asked. Depends who you ask, I said. He grinned. Well, whoever did it is a legend. The funniest moment happened later that evening. Somebody had taped a handmade sign to the front loader. It simply read HOA approved vehicle. I stood there staring at it for nearly a minute before bursting out laughing. I didn't put the sign there. To this day, I don't know who did, but it perfectly captured the absurdity of the whole situation. What Randall intended as a show of authority had turned into a public joke. Every day the tractor remained there, more people noticed. More people talked. More people questioned why a homeowners association would tow a truck from someone's own driveway in the first place. And that's when the real problem started for Randall. He wasn't losing an argument anymore. He was losing public support. People who had quietly tolerated his rules for years were suddenly talking. Neighbors compared violation notices. Residents shared stories about warnings they'd received for harmless things. The tractor became a symbol of something bigger than parking enforcement. It became a symbol of frustration, a symbol of people getting tired of being pushed around. By the morning of the 5th day, the atmosphere had completely changed. I could feel it. The HOA office parking lot seemed busier than usual. Board members were arriving early. People were holding conversations in small groups outside the building. Something was happening behind the scenes. Around noon, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't just Randall calling as HOA president. This time, it sounded personal. His voice lacked the confidence I'd heard before. The edge was gone, and the moment he started talking, I knew the balance of power had finally shifted. The moment I answered the phone, I could tell this wasn't the same Randall I'd spoken to a few days earlier. Gone was the polished confidence, the carefully measured authority, the tone of a man who assumed everyone would eventually do what he wanted. What I heard instead was someone who had spent several sleepless nights dealing with a problem he couldn't control. Ethan, he said, and that alone caught my attention because he had never used my first name before. I'd like to discuss a possible resolution. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the kitchen window toward my driveway, where my truck sat exactly where it belonged. I am listening. There was a long pause before he continued. The board is willing to revisit the vehicle policy. I almost laughed. Revisit. Such a polite word for backtracking. That's interesting. I said, a week ago the policy seemed pretty important. He ignored that. We believe there may have been some ambiguity in how the regulations were enforced. Ambiguity? I repeated. My truck got towed off my own property. Another pause. We're prepared to make adjustments. What he didn't say was that the board had spent the last several days dealing with angry residents, embarrassing social media posts, and questions they couldn't answer. He didn't mention the dozens of emails. He didn't mention the community meeting rumors. It definitely didn't mention the fact that his carefully maintained image was unraveling in front of everyone. But he didn't have to. I could hear it in his voice. Here's my adjustment, I said calmly. My truck stays in my driveway. No finis. No warning letters. No towing threats. Not next week. Not next month. Not 6 months from now. He exhaled slowly. And if the board agrees? The tractor goes home. Another silence. Then finally, I'll be in touch. The call ended. The next 24 hours felt strangely quiet after everything that had happened. No emails. No threats. No dramatic confrontations. Just silence. It reminded me of the moment before a thunderstorm breaks, when the air gets still and everyone knows something is coming. The following morning, I opened my mailbox and found an official envelope from the association. For a second, I just stood there holding it. Then I walked inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened it carefully. Melissa watched from across the room. Well, she asked. I read the letter once, then twice. Then I handed it to her. She scanned the page and immediately started laughing. No way. Oh, yes way. The board had formally amended the parking policy. Pickup trucks were now explicitly permitted in residential driveways, provided they were operational and properly maintained. Just like that. After months of warnings, threats, and towing fees, the rule had changed. Not because Randall suddenly discovered common sense. Not because the board experienced a moral awakening. It changed because they finally encountered resistance they couldn't intimidate away. Melissa shook her head. All of this over a truck. No, I said, not over a truck. She looked at me for a moment and nodded because she understood exactly what I meant. It had never really been about the truck. It was about control. It was about whether ordinary homeowners had any say when authority figures decided to push boundaries. It was about standing up before small abuses became bigger ones. That afternoon, I drove out to the HOA office one final time. The tractor was still sitting there exactly where I'd left it. The famous sign had disappeared sometime during the previous day, but people were still slowing down to look at it as they passed. I climbed into the seat, turned the key, and the diesel engine rumbled back to life. As I pulled away from the curb, a couple walking nearby actually applauded. One guy raised his coffee cup toward me like we were celebrating a championship victory. I couldn't help smiling. The drive back to the farm felt different from the drive into town 5 days earlier. Back then I had been angry. Now I felt something closer to satisfaction. Not triumph. Not revenge. Satisfaction. The kind that comes from knowing you stood your ground when it mattered. When I finally parked the tractor inside the equipment shed, I shut off the engine and sat there for a minute listening to the silence. Then I climbed down, closed the shed doors, and went back to living my life. Over the next several months, things slowly returned to normal. My truck stayed in the driveway. No more violation notices arrived. No more threatening letters appeared in the mailbox. Randall still served on the board, but people looked at him differently now. The aura of unquestioned authority was gone. Residents started attending meetings more often. Questions got asked. Decisions faced scrutiny. People realized that rules weren't automatically right simply because someone in power wrote them down. And honestly, I think that lesson was worth more than the towing fee I paid. Every once in a while, though, I'd find myself driving past the HOA office on my way through town. And every single time, I'd glance toward the curb where the tractor had spent those 5 unforgettable days. The tire marks eventually faded. The jokes died down. New neighborhood dramas replaced the old ones. That's how communities work. People move on. But even now, years later, I still smile when I pass that spot because I remember the look on Randall's face during our final conversation. Not anger, not hatred, just the realization that power only works when people agree to surrender it. The truth is, some viewers will probably think I went too far. Maybe they're right. Maybe parking a giant tractor outside the HOA office was petty. Maybe it was childish. Maybe there were more mature ways to handle the situation. But here's the question I still ask myself whenever I think about that week. If I had simply accepted what happened, if I had quietly paid the fee, moved my truck, and obeyed a rule that never should have existed in the first place, what would they have done next? What rule would have come after that? What homeowner would have been targeted next? I honestly don't know the answer. What I do know is that my truck never got another warning. And sometimes, when authority forgets where its limits are, the most effective response isn't yelling, threatening, or fighting. Sometimes it's parking a bright red tractor exactly where everyone can see it and letting the absurdity speak for itself. So now I want to hear from you. Did I do the right thing, or did I take the situation too far? If you were in my position, would you have fought back the same way, or would you have handled it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like this always divide people right down the middle. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who thought they could push you around simply because they had a little authority, share your story too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.